Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to Tavola Aperta. This is a special project that Christine Massel wanted for this year's 57th International Art Exhibition entitled Viva Arte Viva. Our guest today is Hassan Khan, who we welcome here, and we are really happy to have you with us today. I also want to welcome all our guests. This is an open conversation, so please participate. It does not want to be a dialogue only between me and Hassan. Hassan Khan is exhibiting in this year's exhibition at the Giardino delle Vergini with a work that won the Silver Lion this year for a promising young artist.
This is the joke.
This is a joke. Well, you're still young. No? With the following motivation for the special and intimate relationship that his work establishes with the spectator, to whom he suggests a connection between voice, sound, and horizon. His composition for a public park creates an immersive experience which beautifully intertwines the political and the poetic.
Okay.
So, well, congratulations for that. And the work, as mentioned in the motivations, is entitled "Composition for a Public Part," and it's made up of 3 parts, 3 different scores of music.
Free movements. Yeah.
And each one is accompanied by a libretto, also by a text. Yes. So I wanted to ask you to tell us something about these 3 movements.
Okay.
And
Sure. All right. Is it working?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. No, I don't. Oh, yeah. Now it's working.
Yeah, now it's working.
Okay. So composition for a public park is, as you mentioned, is a piece that is composed of 3 movements. Each movement has a different title and a different musical language and a different libretto, a text that is heard in the voice of a man and a woman. So movement 1 is titled Stasis and Majesty. And movement 1, well, the thing that connects all the movements is that they, through their textual component, is that they are sort of trying to find a place or to find the voice for a place where it's not describing, but trying to touch this place where we, as you know, citizens of a shared community, wherever we are in the world, are engaged with something that has to do with who we think we are, so something to do with how our understanding of ourself and our sense of ourself, and at the same time has to do with the world around us and what we think we're doing in that world. So I'm trying to sort of, you know, it's hard to explain exactly what this area is, but that's sort of the area I'm interested in. So it's not really about public and private. I think these are silly words to kind of simplify ideas, but it's kind of about this border between these 2 things that are, of course, you know, meshing into each other. There isn't a clear line between them. So that's just a very general sort of sense of what this libretto is about for the whole piece. But it takes different forms. So movement 1, Stasis and Majesty, starts through the voice of, you know, let's say the subjectivity of it is through the filter of an old man who is at parts. He is, you know, there is a certain bitterness, and at the same time, there's a certain fascination with the majesty of, I don't want to call it the majesty of life, but just the sense of, you know, the grandness of just existing, something like that. That's sort of the first movement. The second movement, which is called the revolving jewel, the gender is not very clear for the subject. So the subject is sort of, it's almost like at points it seems to be a male subject, and at points it seems to be a female subject, so the gender becomes a little bit fluid. But the libretto and the text is really dealing with emotions that revolve around seduction and loss, and the sense of being, you know, driven by certain motivations and driven by certain desires, and at the same time, the almost painful and I use the word beauty in this movement specifically, and painful and almost beautiful sense of something being completely lost. And there is a creature joining us. So that's the second movement. And then the third movement, which is called No Political Romanticism, is actually quite different. And it's designed to be, in the sense that they're movement one, movement two, movement three, something different happens. We move outside of the subjectivity of an individual or a character or, a human being into, or it attempts or it tries to speak through the voice of forces. So the forces that I'm interested in that movement are the forces of anger and containment through the attempt at transformation and change. So there's something here in the third movement where it kind of opens up into almost something historical, but again, that is spoken through not a subjectivity, so it's not an individual, but it's almost trying to give voice to these forces, and it's as if these forces are addressing us as humans. So it says, you will become like this, or you will feel this, or you will do this, and it's sort of almost a description of a condition that inhabits us, in which there is anger and containment, these two things like kind of rotating around each other. And the title of that movement is very important for me, No Political Romanticism, and it's important that it's no political romanticism, not no to political romanticism. I think that's taking the two out of this phrase is significant. So that's sort of a description of what is happening in terms of the libretto in the piece. In terms of the music, there's something else because each movement has a different language. The first movement is a brass ensemble and a piano and horns that are mizmor, like local Upper Egyptian horns. The second movement is electronic processing and a classical Arabic music small ensemble. And the third movement is string quartet, clapping, and contrabass. So they're totally different musical languages and instrumentation. Each movement has a different duration. So although they're all looping, they're not locked in one deadly cycle, which is also very important. The relationship between each movement and the next is always changing. So that allows the piece to breathe and to be alive and to gives people the chance to spend a long time, even though they're listening to the same thing over and over again, but it never feels like it's just the same thing over and over again, because the relationship between them is changing. So when this relationship changes, even the same thing is not the same thing, it's something else. So at the same time, the whole piece is asking from the viewer to treat it as a series of discrete units that are totally individual on their own, and is asking the participant or the viewer or the visitor maybe is better, to treat it as one huge total thing. So, the visitor is sort of invited to have this double perception, to be both focused on something very close and at the same time to be engaged with a totality that is bigger than that closeness. And that is also reflected in how it is designed in terms of the geography of the garden, and also in terms of the way that it is broadcast as a multi-channel piece. So the instruments are coming out of different speakers. You are able to walk through the composition. You're able to walk through the movements. So each movement has its own geographical space. You can explore that. You can hear the voice of the libretto on a specific speaker, so you can stand next to it and have an intimate relation with the human voice that is speaking. And it's also in English and Italian, that's important, and they're separated in different speakers, so people, depending on their language, can listen to it. And that's also to do with the piece that whichever country it's shown in, there will always be, the text is always translated in the local language and always recorded in the local language and broadcast in the local language. So I think it's better now that we get some comments, questions, whatever, something like that. I mean, it's always, I'll just say one thing. It's always, there is a difficulty in speaking about one's work, not in putting words to it or describing it or thinking about it. The difficulty is in the repetition of things, because you have conversations and you think about it and you talk about it, etc. So there's always sometimes the tendency to repeat the same things because they make sense and because they're real. And for me, the challenge is to try to find new ways to talk about about something again and again and again. So I need your help to like kind of hit me with questions so I can try to come up with something new.
Of course. So is there anybody? Yes, please, just can I kindly ask you to use the microphone?
Oh, right. Hello, my name is Angela Hidon, and I'm found it very interesting what you were just saying right now about that every country that this moves to, that then the language is translated. So now my question is to you, because is what do you seek in the voice from that country? What quality of voice, whether it's a genderless voice, whether it's gendered, but what, you know, because yes, when you move through it, you can like have that experience either in English or here in that, you know. But what are you part of making those decisions as to
Sure.
what voices?
Of course.
Okay.
And the voices I'm looking for, it's a bit tricky. I mean, it's there's technical aspects that it should be clear and understandable. I always record in the voice of a man and a woman, so you hear both. So you hear one and then the other. I try to find voices that are sort of distinct but not eccentric in a way. So to sort of like have communicability and presence, but not to be so focused on that this voice specifically is carrying something.
Are you able to direct it?
Yes,
Okay.
of course.
So you
Yeah,
do that?
I direct it. Yes, of course. In the recording studio, I find the people who are gonna record, and then while they're recording, I ask them to read it this way or that way. We try things, and but it's sort of a broadcast.
Right.
So, but it doesn't want to sound like a broadcast. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that everywhere this work goes, that there is that
Yeah.
that communication and accessibility.
Yes. Because it's a public work, so it has to live publicly. Yeah.
So it was shown for the first time in 2013, right?
Yes.
Created for the Nuit Blanche in Paris at the Park of the Belleville.
Parc de Belleville, yes.
Did it change? Did the work change? How much did it change, and what changed?
Yes, it's different. I mean, the content is not. The music is the same, and the libretto is the same. I mean, of course, I re-recorded it now in English and Italian. It was in French in Parc de Belleville. It changed because of the nature of the park and the giardino della Vergine. The Parc de Belleville is a big public park. It's very urban. It's in the middle of the city in Paris. It's in a sort of popular neighborhood in Belleville. It's full of drug dealers, people making out, families. It's full of the urban sort of sense, and it's also on a big hill. So it goes. There's a certain natural geography for it that goes from the top to the bottom, and all of this was taken into account in how I designed the space there, and how I placed the speakers there, and how I mixed it. So there is a mix that is done live in the space. In Belleville, it was a monumental mix. We used, first of all, there was, of course, because it's much bigger, there was much more speakers, but there were also much bigger speakers, and the broadcast was done, the volume was louder, and they were on big tripods, not on these thin kind of black poles that we use here. So it was kind of done in a way to claim this big urban space with a big gesture. Here, the garden is, of course, much more intimate. It's beautiful in this kind of, beautiful way. And so my relationship to the space there is much more intimate also. I kind of responded to that and decided to design it as a much more intimate. The mix is much lower. The volume is lower. Also, it creates, I think, a totally different experience. And in Belleville, of course, also because of the nature of the visitors. In Belleville, it's this kind of urban, and it's really, it was great because it was visited by 20,000 people in one night at Nuit Blanche. So it was a great audience. I mean, I was really very, very happy with the outcome. And it was definitely an audience that was completely random and, was not an audience that is going there like in the Biennale. It's different because you're coming here to look at art, etc. So that's the difference. Yeah.
So in Belvedere, it was just your piece.
Yes, it was just my piece.
Because there's an interesting critical issue.
Right.
Not about the artistic practice that I admired and rather enjoyed.
Okay.
My name is Don Druick. I'm a Canadian playwright, dramaturgo canadese. And the interesting issue is when we share the space in a group artistic format, which the Biennale, except for the individual pavilions, certainly is.
Yes.
So when I'm in that garden at the end of the Arsenale, which is a charming little garden, and I loved your piece, I loved a lot of the work there. Some of the sheds were a bit musty for my taste, but that's just history.
Right.
But the point is, the audio engages itself with your colleagues who are also exhibiting in the same space, in the same garden, giardino. So you think there's a social political issue here because you're imposing on other artists.
Sure.
I
understand.
It's an interesting issue.
Of course. I mean, that is the difficulty of working with sound or music as a medium, is that it is a medium that is just transported. And so it sort of permeates things. That's true. That is something that you will find in all group exhibitions where there are works that are audiovisual or audio or something. That is part of.
When you walk into the main,
of course.
The main space.
Of course.
There's nothing but sound everywhere you
Of course. So I mean, of course, it's a little difficulty. I don't know if. I guess it depends on the kinds of works, because there's also the works in the park at the end. There's a lot of the works that, especially around my piece, that are more sculptural, like the Michel Blasé growing things, and the garden right next to me also has sculptural works. And I think there this issue is much less. It's much more difficult if you're looking at a work, for example, that also has audio or is something. Then I think it becomes really critical. But with objects like that, with objects and forms, I think it's maybe acceptable, because it's also then becomes part of like the soundscape that is part of the landscape almost.
It's certainly normal. It's
right
now.
Right.
In 2017.
Right.
There's lots of audio.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
I just find the issue quite interesting.
Yeah. Sure. Me too. No. Thank you. Yeah.
Also, yes, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Have some food.
Hi, I'm Susan from Australia.
Hello.
Hi. So could you tell us a little bit about your background that brought you to, are you a musician?
Right. My bio says I'm an artist, a musician, and a writer. And I say I'm an artist and a musician and a writer. I make this distinction very clearly and intentionally. So I work in these three fields professionally, in all three fields. There are points where the works do cross. So there are parts where, like in this piece, for example, music plays a big role, text plays a big role, but I consider it an artwork. But then there are other works where it's a musical work, or where I'm actually writing, where I published a novella last year or something. So that's just general. My practice does engage with different forms, and I use these forms in their specific fields, and I sort of migrate between these things. Now, just to give you a little bit of context about how I arrived to that point, I didn't study art, and I didn't study music. I actually studied literature in university. I went to university when I was quite young, so I was 15 when I entered university, and it was I was speaking about this yesterday, but I have to now say some of the things I said before. But it was a very intense experience, maybe because I was so young, and then suddenly thrown into this kind of field in which a lot of things got jumbled up, the way things at that age do, and in which I sort of engaged with a massive amount of sources and references, whether they were in cinema or literature or theater or music or, across all these kind of fields of cultural production, I engaged with these things from different places, different times, historical epochs, different areas in the world. And this engagement was done without the idea of a hierarchy. So at that time, in this kind of age between 15 and 20, when I was in university, there was like, it was like almost an intense, insane, crazy, passionate affair with all these references and sources that at the same time, that didn't have a hierarchy. So there was no sense of, this is better than this. It's just like what I'm engaged with. And there was no sense that there's any real difference between something that is from the 12th century in India and something that is from the 20th century in New York, for example. I mean, this is not exactly my position now, but that's how I engaged with these things at the time. And I think that has been very formative, because then I came out of that experience and I discovered that I'm an artist. By the end of these years, I had been doing things, and also I was playing music with friends and doing things in bedrooms and weird stuff and parties with chicken and stuff like that. But then in the end, by the time I kind of like found myself, I'm done with this, I discovered that I have a practice. And it started becoming public. So there was a point where I started showing these things to a public, and the audience responded to it in the beginning incredibly negatively, and I had to make a choice at that point. Do I continue doing this? Does it make sense to do this or not? Or do I stop? And my choice was, yes, I continue to do this, and I claim that space, and I'm ready to face this kind of very negative response, and I think it's my right to do that. And when I thought that, then I think I discovered that I'm an artist. So it's a kind of a different path than, for example, going to an art school and saying, I'm going to learn to become an artist, because I didn't think about it in those terms. I just found myself to be that. And then that also ran in parallel to these other practices with music and with writing. At different points in my career, there are different focuses. So at points, the art practice is bigger. At points, the music practice is bigger. At points, it's been like this over the past 20 years. But that's for me a privilege, a great privilege to kind of interweave these things and sort of move between them.
So you can write music you can write a score without having to learn?
No, I cannot write a score, but I find ways to, for example, in music, I find ways to use my ignorance to produce something. This is for me actually a very powerful tool. So, for example, there are different pieces that are scored that I've done in different ways. There was a piece from 2007 called 12 Pieces for Piano and Electronica, which I scored on the computer. So I actually had a software that had a score, and I was placing the notes and listening to them and trying things out and trying things on a keyboard and listening, till I had a score. And then I went to the pianist, and he started interpreting that score, and then I adjusted the score while he was interpreting it, and we just adjusted it in person, and then we had the score and we recorded it. So that's one method. And then, for example, in 2014, I have a piece called Taraban, which is based upon a musical piece called Taraban, which is based upon a recomposition of two classical Arabic songs from the early 20th century. And for this, for example, what I did is I consulted with professional kind of musicians to get a sort of almost like a crash course in what the scales that are being used and how they're constructed and stuff. And then I analyzed the source material to try to understand how it was put together. And then I chose elements in it that I then had musicians play, and while they were playing, I asked them to almost work as machines. So while they're playing the thing over and over, specific moments in these original tracks that I found pivotal and that I found had structural meaning in how this music was working. And then when I asked them to play it, so they're playing it, and then while they're playing it, it's almost like a human machine. I'm like changing things. I'm like, okay, go up here 2 tones, go down there 3 tones, till we had a melody that made sense, that sort of was a ghost of what existed before. And then I recorded that. And then when I came to record that, I asked them also to play for like 20 minutes the same thing for other reasons, so as to drain it from the affect of, like a studio musician has a certain affect and a certain accent that comes out of their own practice that I wanted to get rid of, for example. So to do this, I just had to have them repeat it till it almost became, something like a flow that they didn't have total control over, and then I could use that in my own composition. So these are just examples of processes that one can use without knowing how to do something. And I mean, I've been doing this for many years, as I said, for 20 years. And I've been thinking at one point, well, maybe, I mean, I could have taught myself more, or I could have actually learned more, but I don't feel ready to learn these things. I feel like so far, maybe it's not forever, but so far it's been very productive to work with ignorance. Because every time I try to do something, I have to produce a whole system to get to it. And then that system is a challenge and a risk, of course. And that's, for me, quite important, to be at this moment of risk and challenge all the time, and to really have the fear of failure is really incredibly important. And so the fear and possibility of failure, of utter and absolute failure. So somehow I think I'm trying to trick myself into this position, and then, you know, kind of like getting through and discovering a way of working, and then we see if the results make sense or not.
I think there's a question here.
Hi. Maybe you should eat something.
Yeah, I'll eat some grapes. Okay. Yes.
I have a question. I find it quite hard to define the limits of art. So if you define yourself as separated categories, how do you define them? What is the limit? What is not art then?
It's a good question, but there's a strategic, in some ways you're right. It is hard to define the limits, and it is amorphous in some ways, in some sense. But for me, there's a strategic reason why I decide to do this. One is that the economy, the very economy of the industry, that's something, you know, that is very defined. The economy of the art industry is very defined. The economy of the music industry is very defined, etc. And that to me means something. Actually, it's not that it doesn't mean anything. It means that even though there is this kind of amorphous, you know, interweaving of fields, actually there is an economy behind them that makes them function within specific parameters. I think that, you know, every economy has a secret, and part of the secret of a secret that has to do with exploitation, actually. And part of the secret of the art economy is that it claims that everything is sort of the same, and it claims that it can actually use everything, which it does. But I think that comes at a price. I think that of course gives you a great freedom, but at the same time, it's very easy to find that things are, I mean, that there is an exploitation of what's around us. There's an exploitation, you know, with art, of course, just to put it very bluntly and very clearly, there's trends, you know. Dance suddenly is really big in art, or music suddenly is really big in art, or philosophy at one point was suddenly very big in art. Philosophy and theory was suddenly very big in art. And these trends, I mean, it's not that they're not valid. They're valid because everything is valid. That's part of the mystery of this area. However, they're not accidental. They do serve a function. They do serve an economic function. They do help create, you know, a certain market at a certain point of time, and then they're used up, and then the moment passes, and a lot of this stuff just disappears. This is, for me, critical.
So it's liberating not to be considered as art? Is that what you say in a sense?
No, what I'm trying to say is that there's two things happening at the same time. Yes, there is something liberating in being able to work in a field where you can really do anything. You can make a film, you can make a score, you can and treat it as a work. I mean, there's of course a certain freedom in that and a certain power in that, but at the same time, one has to be aware that this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening within a context, and that context, the economics and politics of that context, is to sort of exploit all other fields and to sort of use them to renew yourself. So the art system is always renewing itself by cannibalizing the world and by sort of like sociology, you know, dance, you know, it's doing this. It's sort of eating everything around it. Out of this, amazing things happen. Out of it, a lot of stuff that is really crap happens too. That's just part of it. But then what is given back to these fields, for example? Not much. I mean, I feel privileged to function in all these different fields, and I have friends in different fields. And I know when I speak with my friends who are, like, for example, musicians, who are like really unhappy with the way the art world treats them, for example. And because they get lifted and taken and but then they don't, in the end, they don't really get much out of it, you know? It's just because they're serving something else. And I think it's just important to be aware of that. And so that's why I like to put in my bio that, you know, I'm an art, and I say artist with a capital A, you know, just to sort of like make that point, to claim, you know, if I'm functioning within something, then let's be clear about it. You know, let's not hide things. If there's a privilege and a power in that position, let's claim it and say that is how it is. That's where I'm coming from, and that's how I'm going to function. I think that's a more respectable and responsible way to deal than to try to just, you know, make everything sort of wishy-washy and say it's all, you know, that's everything and just creative and blah.
Is it more craft to be considered as a musician or as a writer? Then it goes into a bit more the applied art compared to art. Is it like the?
No. It's okay. It's just my relationship to the material. So, for example, if I'm performing a concert, and then my relationship to the music I'm doing is one of a musician. I am playing this music, and I am a musician at this moment, and I've composed this music as a musician. I understand a musician, and I understand the audience as an audience that is coming to see and listen and hear music. But if I'm making a work of art that involves music, although the skill that is being used and the experience comes from my experience as a musician, I am thinking of it as an artist. So I'm treating it in a different way. I make different choices. There might be some things I like more as a musician, but they don't fit what I want to happen here. So I change, you know, the music itself to serve this function of something else. I think that's the difference. The same with text. If I'm writing a text just because I want to write a text, whether it's an essay or a story or a novella or whatever, then I'm a writer at that moment. And I'm saying a writer, not author. I also make a distinction. And because a writer is wider, you can read. I see it as like that. You're just actually using text. You're writing text, not just crafting a specific genre. So that's different than, again, in an artwork where there's a textual element. You know, then the text there is serving that function, and I'm writing it very specifically for that function, and that's it. So that's kind of why I also make these distinctions.
You want to? Yes, please.
Returning to the piece here at the Biennale, I wanted to ask you one more comment about the relation of the text and the music. And in general, what's, in your ideas, the relation between concepts and abstract forms?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So this is the genesis of this piece was that I was invited by Nuit Blanche in 2013 to do something. I went to Paris to see the venues. In the beginning, they wanted me to do maybe a concert, something like this, and they're like, "Well, you want to use this space and that space?" And then I saw the park, and as one of the places that were available. And the moment I saw the park, I was like, yes, I want this park, and I want to do this. Like immediately on the spot, I knew that I wanted to produce this piece in this park. I imagined, like immediately I saw it, I imagined a piece that is made out of music and that you can walk through it, and I kind of had the whole imagination of what this piece would be. And I said, yes, let's do this. We had very short time. I knew I was, again, taking a huge risk, and it was, you know, it could have like really fucked up, but I sort of decided to take that risk. But when I started working on it, and I wasn't sure, like text or not text, this was like in the back of my mind. But when I started working on it, I immediately thought there has to be something that breaks the seductive power. You know, this is the problem of music in artwork. And for me, it's also a personal problem. You know, music has a seductive power. That's just part of the form. And it's easy for that power to overwhelm other things. If you're doing a concert, it doesn't matter. You know, that's again another difference. You're doing a concert, you're just doing a concert. You know, go completely crazy. It's fine. But if you're doing a work, it does matter, because maybe the work wants to do something else other than just seduce you, or you know, or hit you with something powerful. There are other things that one needs to engage with. So I didn't want to produce an experience in which people are just having a beautiful time in the park. This was not my aim. I wanted that to be a layer, and there's a reason why there is a sense of beauty in the piece too, but it's just a layer to produce something else. It's not the end, the aim, or the goal. So the text became important. I started then thinking that it's very important that there's something like a grain, some kind of grain that is inserted in this that creates some kind of resistance that breaks that sort of, you know, mood, and so that the visitor is engaged with this and that at the same time. Of course, the nature of the piece is that it's very open and people can just experience it and have a good time and sit in the park and have a picnic, and that's fine, absolutely fine, of course. That's part of the work, but at least the option exists for it to become something else. And that's why the text became important. And when I decided that, I knew the second thing that became important is that I wanted that text to be both close and far. So it's something that people, when they listen to, they can identify with in some sense. And it's written in that tone that, you know, I was consciously, as I was writing, I was thinking, how can I communicate to the listener a sense in which they feel that what they're hearing is something they've experienced or something that they have actually an internal, interior experience of. At the same time, it's something they cannot own and contain and, you know, possess completely. So it's something that is sort of inside you, but at the same time it's outside you and you cannot claim it. And that was also very important for me to try, I mean, I don't know if it succeeds or not, to try to write a text that can do that. So then I thought of recognition and identification, and at the same time, you know, not alienation. Alienation is too strong, but identification and recognition, and at the same time, otherness or something that is slightly out of your hand or out of your control. That also came from the same process, that idea of that space. This is an important space, I believe. I mean, I have other works that try to touch that space from a long time ago in different ways. You know, also works with video and works, but really I find that space is there's something very profound in that area of the thing that is very identifiable and feels totally interior, yet at the same time is completely unpossessable. Yeah.
Okay. So what did you write first? The score or the text, or did which one followed the other, or were they written together?
I honestly don't remember exactly, but I think it was happening at the same time. I was sort of working on the music and writing and changing also the text, and you know, I didn't write it in just one go. I was testing and tweaking it a little bit and things like that. So it was sort of, yeah, it was happening at the same time.
So both were written expressly for the work, or
yes,
not?
Yes.
Yeah.
There is one thing though. The third movement came from the sessions of another piece that I produced that same year, earlier in the year, but it was a musical piece called Live Ammunition, music for clapping, string quartet, and live electronics. And that piece was done as a musical piece that I performed live. But and it was done like a few months before Composition for a Public Park. But when I started working on Composition for a Public Park, I worked on Movement 1 and Movement 2, and I had very clear ideas of like, that Movement 1 would be the brass and like would have this sort of majestic thing and and I was working on that. And I kept thinking Movement 3 to me, like I just had that title, No Political Romanticism. That was just like going in my head, no political romanticism, no political romanticism. And then I was like, yes, but that piece, Live Ammunition, again, the titles are very connected, is perfect. I mean, it really talks about what I want to talk about in here. So then I used the sessions that I had recorded for Live Ammunition to produce this movement. So the movement is not completely synonymous with Live Ammunition. They're different. Also, Live Ammunition is a live performance, so it changes. But the instrumentation is the same. The melodic structure is the same. And so let's say they're different versions of something. So that happened. Yeah.
And another thing I wanted to ask you is the title of the second movement, The Revolving Jewel.
Yes.
Does it have any relationship
to
and
Jewel?
what with Jewel? Because it was done slightly later than Jewel.
Yeah,
but
2010. Jewel is 2010. I mean, I guess it must have, because the revolving jewel and in Jewel there's a revolving speaker, that has a sort of jewel inside of it. And so there must be something related, but not really directly, I guess.
It's not intentional.
No, it's not like a reference to the work. It's just like that title fit what I had in mind, somehow. It's based on an experience I had an acid trip when I was 19 years old.
Are there? Yes, please.
I'm gonna look at you like this.
Since the work has been exhibited here or played,
And now you're visiting it after maybe 4 or 6 months?
3 months? 4 months?
Well, nearly 4.
4 months.
Are there any surprises or things that you don't acknowledge in the work the last time you saw it?
Okay. Yes, thank you. The first surprise is that one of the speakers was not working, so my piano playing is missing. And I hope it gets fixed. I think we're working on it.
They're working on it.
They're working on it. So that was the first surprise. The piano. And then the second surprise was that, I found these cobwebs on the speakers, and it was really emotional, actually. It was kind of strange because I kept trying to take pictures of the cobwebs, but it's so hard. But actually, they were like quite intricate and spiders, and they had little flies. And it was like really, it made sense, actually. It was like totally made sense that, of course, nature just does whatever it does. And, in a maybe slightly melodramatic way, I just thought, it would be really great if it just decays completely and just keeps playing until it's completely claimed and stops and breaks down. So I had that kind of emotional response to seeing this sort of like, the wear and tear of life. And also because it's a technological intervention in an organic system somehow. So, it kind of like made sense, this kind of interaction to happen. In terms of the piece itself, I mean, I visited it yesterday. I don't know if I didn't really give myself time to experience it. I just saw it. I think I'm afraid to actually like sit and listen to it and experience it. Somehow I think so. I'm not sure why, but yeah, I think that's what. So I went, I met some students, some art students, and talked about the piece and stuff, and that was fine. But I didn't, I walked through it, but I was almost embarrassed to like sit and experience it myself. I don't know why.
Why is that?
I have no idea. I really don't know, but that's how I felt, sort of. So.
Why did you choose this piece for the exhibition?
Yes,
the composition for a public park, because it's very peculiar because it is, as the title says, a composition for a public park.
Yes.
Within an exhibition,
but
the Giardino della Vergini is the only public space of the Arsenale.
Yeah.
It is actually a public park, the only one accessible without an entrance ticket.
Why this piece? I mean, there are two reasons.
There are two reasons.
Yeah. First is that I showed it in Nuit Blanche in 2013 for one night only, and since then I've been trying to show it. There was always a lot of interest, but it's always very difficult because it's technologically a bit complex, and to have it in a public park is difficult in any country. So it's a complicated work to really put up. So for over the past 4 years, I had many discussions with different potential possibilities that always in the end were not able to do it, whether it was for lack of money or lack of possibility. So that's just strategic. I want to show this piece. And that was a good situation to do it. The second part was when I was speaking with Christine, and she was speaking, I asked her, why are you interested in my work also? And like her answers about her interest in my work also made me think that this would be a piece that would fit sort of her image of what I'm doing. I don't necessarily feel that I'm responsible to fit the image of what curators think I'm doing, but in this case, it seemed to be a happy coincidence that that was also something I wanted to show. So therefore, it works. So I suggested it, and she was very enthusiastic about it. And she suggested the space here. She sent me pictures, and then when I came on a site visit and saw it, I was like, yes, let's do it here. I was afraid in the beginning because it was like, I was like, how are we going to manage that space? And I thought we have to have a plan B. And in the end, it worked, and it was fine. So.
Yeah, also because it's the last on the map.
Yes.
It's the last work at the Arsenale.
That's great. That feels great.
And there is this curious thing, because normally people, when they get to the end, they're like exhausted, and
they can sit down and
half of the people just ask where the exit is or where a bar for a spritz is. But instead, your work is it's beautiful and it's pleasant and it's relaxing, but also it's engaging, and you see a lot of people actually staying there for more than just the 30 seconds it takes to go through. They
Yes,
sort
true.
of lie down, and
That's true.
I think that's something wonderful.
No, that's great. I'm very happy to be number 93. And seriously, I think that works very well. And it's for the reasons you pointed out. It's a good place for this work to be. Because I think it's difficult for a work like this to be in the middle of a list. These are the difficulties of group exhibition formats, large group exhibition formats. The danger of works becoming elements on a list, that's a difficult thing. And this is a work that for me cannot other works maybe can do that, but this work I think needs to be treated differently. So I guess it was great that Christine also thought of that. I think that was a very good choice also, and I was happy with it.
Yes, please, just one microphone. Can somebody? Okay.
So earlier you talked about the functionality of like identity, like how you claim.
Sorry, I didn't. Is it working?
Yes, it's working. But
it's working. Sorry, I'll speak a little louder. But so earlier you were talking about how, depending on the situation and the space, you claim a certain, like you claim to be an artist at one space or like a musician in another. So I think of it, I interpret it as the functionality of your identities, like how you,
functionality
of your identity,
of
like
my
how
identity.
you claim different ones as you go. So I was wondering do you have, is there an identity of yours that you would claim it always, regardless of the situation, even if it put you in like like a position that you wouldn't benefit as much? Does that make sense?
I'm trying to understand exactly. Just say it clearly.
Yeah.
Like you want to say something.
Yes.
Yes.
I want to say that, so is there any part of your identity that you would claim regardless of the difficult position you would be put in by claiming it?
Okay. Yes, I think so. A sense of self-respect is important, and I guess that's let's say a guideline. A guideline to like what how you treat yourself and how you present yourself. So regardless of, of course, also artist, musician, writer, we're speaking here in terms of professional contexts, but regardless of these contexts, when one is dealing in the world, in life, I guess that would be, for me, a guideline of some sort. I don't know if it's an identity, but it's a guideline. I don't know if that answers the question. But I think your question has something to do, I feel like you're trying to ask something to do with functionality. So, do you find it like, maybe not disturbing, but like somehow critical that one fashions themselves in a way to sort of fit within a specific system so that they're treated in a certain way and to take advantage of that? Is that
in a way, because like even for just convenience, for instance, like if I were to be so I'm like from Vietnam, but I go to school in the States. So it just suits me better to introduce myself a certain way when I'm in different situations. For instance, if I'm in Vietnam, I'd be like, oh, I'm Vietnamese, and like I go to school here, and I pretend like I'm from here, I stay here, I live here. Whereas when I go in the States, sometimes I wouldn't even bother saying I'm Vietnamese, or just be like, oh, I'm American, just for the convenience of it.
Yeah.
And it's just something that, I don't know, I'm at this age where I think like identity is so fluid.
Right.
So I just wondering, what is one part of identity you hold so dearly that you would never say otherwise?
I don't know. What is that? That must be something very important, but what is it? I don't know.
I think fluidity is really interesting because, identity is fluid, say.
Yeah.
One day we are young, one day, our identities are older, sometimes so, that fluidity, and I do understand her question, and I'm sorry, I was actually very interested about the fact that you have written a novella, and I was wondering whether within this novella, since you bring up identity, whether this question of identity is something that permeates your novella.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. Hey!
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No. The novella is, novella is happening all over the world. It's a very fast, sort of cheap novella where there's like people in different places and different countries and different relationships. and there's also like a corporation called Corporation Incorporated, and a society called the Holy Idiot Society, and an experiment that has gone kind of terribly wrong, where primates are primates are civilizationally meshing with artificial intelligence to produce an alternative sort of social order to the human social order. So that's sort of the world of the novella. I don't know if it's about identity. I mean, I guess it's about identity in the sense of the idea of being human is sort of being challenged in this novella somehow. So just that, but it's not more specific than that. Although the characters are very specific. I mean, they're all over the world in different places, but I wrote these characters based a lot on observation, also of friends in university and stuff like that. So there are bits and pieces that come from observation, and they're very specific ways of acting, ways of speaking. So that's very specific. But for me, that's not about identity. That's just about precision and accuracy, in a way, I guess. Yeah.
So there's no character within that has anything to do with that observation of self-identity?
No. Like, there is no stand-in for me, for example. There isn't. No. Yeah.
But there is a thesis that we are all that we produce in our lives.
Could you please use the microphone? Thank you.
Everything we produce is part of our core.
Yes.
Everything, whether it's a dish of barley or risotto, or a work of art, or a composition, or just the way we decorate our bedroom. It's all
true.
Reflects back on who we are.
Of course.
Our sense of ourselves.
Of course, yeah. But I take that as a given. I feel like that's not something that needs to be fetishized or even explored. I feel like that's just how things are, in a way. But there is, but thanks for this comment, because there is, in my way of working with actors, for example, we didn't discuss this because we're not talking about one of these works, but in my way of working with actors, over the years, one thing that I found to be very, very useful has been this approach in which I treat the actor, whether this is a total delusion, actually, but in which I treat the actor as if they are the sum total of human experience. So every person I'm working with, I'm thinking of them not just as this individual, whoever this individual is, but as like sort of the sum total of everything humanity has been through. And by thinking about them in those terms, somehow the way we work together becomes very productive, and something happens, I feel.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. No, it's something that developed over the years. I discovered now I can describe it in those terms, but yeah, I've discovered that makes sort of it happens like that, and it's very useful, and it is very productive in a way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This also has to do with identification, and maybe this is happening also in the case of the public part, no? That the characters that you put there are kind of a sum of humanity as well.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of them in those terms, because that's why in the third movement you enter forces rather than actual subjects. So I'm thinking of them in those terms. But of course, it's very focused. You know, there's an old man, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but yeah.
Yeah, but there's this shift between the fact that you can identify. I mean, you can be a child and identify with him somehow.
Yes.
So there's a kind of a widening. You know, it's not just one old man very characterized, because you want this figure to resonate
Absolutely.
as if could be the whole humanity.
Yes, that's true. I think that's true, and that's why he says things. He's described or he describes himself. Actually, I am an old man. He says this. I am a thin, stooped old man. I think that's what he said. But he describes himself, but then. It's very specific, but then the things he's saying are also very general in a way. I think that's part of that. Yeah, I think you're right. That's true. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, another question is related. Before you were mentioning now that once you speak about yourself, you try to don't repeat yourself.
Yeah, I fail.
to now have another point of view on what was consolidated, no? And another thing, you were speaking about the piece here, and you said no that you didn't feel to stay and listen to it. So I wanted to ask you, also in relation to your work as a performer, so the performance is change, your relation with the final product, and creation and destruction and dismantling of something that you made.
My relation to the final product?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's strange because I started in the beginning. When I first started, I did a lot of installations, video installations. So I saw them, and then they're gone. Like they're works that you can't see again unless you install it again. So that was in the beginning for me. Like that was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Was a little bit difficult. Like I was like, yeah, I had this sort of precious kind of feeling about my work, and also because it felt so transient, and it's shown and then it's experienced and then it's it's very hard to have again. But also as my work progressed and as I also moved into many different mediums, and as I started producing objects and images and other forms that are more permanent, I think my relationship then changed a little bit. So I don't know how it changed, but changed. Something changed. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question.
No.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. It's about this, about you make something, but then your point of view on this change, no? And you show
Yes.
it in many things.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask just for that.
Yeah. Okay. So okay. I understand what you're saying. At one point, I was just in love with my work, with everything, and I was like, there was nothing could shake that. It was like, if people hated it, I didn't care. I loved it. If whatever, it was just like, always in love with my work. And now I'm starting to maybe this is starting to shake a little bit. There are works I start to look at really for the first time almost in my life that I start to feel like maybe I have a little bit of difficulty with some aspects to it. And yeah, that's strange and difficult. I don't know what's happening.
About some older pieces or about new pieces that you have this?
Older pieces, some older pieces. Like suddenly, I watched something, that's 20 years old, and then suddenly I was like, I remember I loved this more. What's happening? I'm getting older.
Your identity is changing.
Yes. It's tough. It's brutal. Whoa. Okay, so let's have a drink then. And,
to make is this?
Yes, it's working.
Just a comment about it took us about 3 tries to find your piece.
Okay.
The first time we just kind of missed even what the map was telling us, and then the second time I don't know what happened. But anyway, when we finally found it, it was. I thought it was very interesting because the part of it was we knew where the place was finally on the map, what it meant, but we didn't know what we were looking for.
Right.
In terms of an object or anything, and so we just sort of kind of stumbled upon it, and I liked that a lot, and it was kind of. It made it kind of a very interesting journey, trying to find it even. And I thought, if it probably could be very interesting in a public park without any notification. I mean, here it's going to be somewhere that's going to somehow look like art because this is the Biennale. But if it was in a public park with no signage and people just literally stumbled upon it at whatever part they came upon, I think that would be really interesting.
Me, that's the ideal situation for it.
It is kind of like that. In fact, someone who works at the Biennale, I had the map, there's the exit, and I'm going looking for Khan, and I'm looking for brooms. Brooms and Khan.
Okay. Right.
Because I knew that there would be these, because they had been there first, and they're like, I know nothing, like, this is the exit. I said, yeah, but there's, but still, I agree with you, Jane, and I like the idea of having to stumble upon it. You know, I thought that worked with a number of the pieces, but particularly with the soundscape drawing you in. You're still like, okay, all right, here. It was quite magical. And
nice
one question I did have, I know I'm asking lots of questions, but
that's what we're here for.
Yeah, okay. In this piece, was there ever a consideration, and I think it was something we talked about, that you considered the competition, say, if there is competition, with the natural sounds? I mean, you mentioned the spider and seeing that, and something that with spider seasons, and it's lovely. I've seen some, but birds. This, how does that factor in any way in your creation?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it doesn't factor because I accept it, of course, and I think it's fine, and you know, like I don't have there was nothing that I thought with or against that. That to me, I mean, I guess what is important is that from the beginning, also when the piece was first made in Paris, what I wanted to do was to not to modify things too much. So there is a sense of intervention, yes, of course, but not, you know, it's not about like changing everything and stuff. So in Paris, for example, there was an element that does not exist here because in Paris it was at night, it was Nuit Blanche. So there's lights, but the lights were not added. The lights were the public lights that were in the park, and what I did is I just modified their colors so that each movement had a different color. So that also when you entered the park from the top of the hill, when you look down, you'd see orange, red, yellow, red, and orange. And you would have a sense of like, it's a visual composition as well. So in that situation, there was a modification of what existed because it's public lights, but that modification also changes how things work. I think that's sort of the logic I'm using. But I wouldn't have, for example, come in and like installed my own lights and created something, you know, right. that I didn't want to do. Just whatever is there, work with it. Like also here, the garden, the landscaping of this garden is how it is. And how it has been for a few years, as far as I remember.
Yeah, more than a few years.
Yeah, so. And you know, I was not interested in trying to change this in any way. I was just like accepting the format and just trying to work with it. I also asked, the administration not to cut the grass, you know, to just let it be, so that the work, you know, that was because while we were installing, like immediately they came and started chopping the grass right the day before the opening, and I was like, no, don't, just leave it, you know. And I'm glad that somehow they followed. I was like, maybe I'll come and it'll be like all chopped, but no, it worked. Yeah, no, that's how it should be. Yeah, of course, and it just evolves, and you know, it's an organic living system, so there's no need to mess with it. Yeah.
Hassan,
yes.
Where else it's going? Do you have any inspiration elsewhere?
There is, at this point of time, there are some conversations about it, but nothing is fixed yet. So I can't really say, like, wherever. I'm happy to show it anywhere, you know, in the world. I'm very happy to show it. And as I said, it's a work that I tried for the past 4 years to show in many places, but it was difficult. Now it's a little bit easier because people have seen it. It's also different than looking at documentation and explaining it, so there's more support. Yeah, there is, of course, the difficulty of public and private, because a lot of places are museums and places like that who want to show the work or are interested in acquiring it, and I want it to be in a public situation, so I'm still struggling with how to do this. But yeah, so that's why there's conversations going on, but nothing yet fixed. Hopefully by the end of this year, you know, things would start to shape up, and I'd find the format and a way to be able to show it in some private context and some public context, and then see what happens, I guess.
I think it would be really interesting to show it on American
Could you please use
on American campuses.
Right.
I will give you my card.
Okay.
And for Arizona State University, and I'm an academic in liberal studies, using a lot more visual things.
Yeah.
And we can be, because I think,
of course.
especially, you know, when we consider some of the atrocious behaviors happening on American campuses, it would be such as in Charlotte, you know.
I mean,
I think in a space, you know, a desert landscape, you know.
Yeah.
Would be a very interesting place.
Sure.
I could. I imagined it even when I was seeing it, and so.
Yeah.
I'd like to make further connection on this.
Sure.
Okay, so please.
I just had a.
And this side is completely. Nobody has any questions or comments on this side.
I just wanted to ask you, what is the place of Arabic traditional music in your work? I mean, what it means to you?
Yeah, it is like everything else. It is like when I was making this comment about the lack of hierarchy. It is something I love parts of it, and so whatever I love, I feel I can work with. So that's it basically. And in this case, the part that has classical Arabic music in it, it made sense when I was composing the piece that there would be this, like the revolving jewel would have this music. It's also like about seduction and loss, and this music does have that sense of something quiet, you know, this emotion, and it does have a cyclical feeling, you know. That was also important for me. So it made sense there to use this instrumentation. But that's what it sort of, that music is, yeah, that's where it is in my work, I guess. Yeah.
It's also very cinematic, though. Maybe there's.
Yeah, this I had actually yesterday, but when I was speaking with the students, there was a question about that, and I have a theory. I have a theory about, because people say that a lot. It's very cinematic, very cinematic, and I have a theory that this is not necessarily about the content as much as it's about suspension. So in you know, because it is cyclical, the whole piece is cyclical. There is no beginning or end, and the music is looping, and the relationships are changing, and you have this kind of system going on. You're not experiencing it as a linear piece. You're experiencing it as a cyclical piece. It creates a sense of suspension. A garden or a park itself creates a sense of suspension. It's a place where things suddenly, you know, rules are suddenly suspended a little bit. No matter in the most repressive, you know, place on earth, the moment you enter a park or a garden, something just shakes, and people suddenly have strange desires, and things happen. I don't know. It's like a bracket. It becomes, you know, a bracket in the urban space, and that was very important for me from the beginning of how I was thinking about this piece. And what I'm trying to do is to produce a bracket within the bracket. So the piece is actually, in a sense, it's a garden as well, a garden on top of the garden, and this garden, this bracket, is suspended. It's like it's not readable. And it's not as one thing, and it's not contained as one thing. It's also hopefully trying to be that thing you can, you know, identify with but cannot completely possess. It's also trying to do that. And because of this sense of suspension, and because it's also a bracket inside of a bracket, I think this sense of that it's cinematic becomes, because then you become the protagonist. You know, it's cinematic because this is when we watch films are about suspension. The way they're edited and the way they're projected, they do create a sense of a suspended time. And that suspended time, there are characters inside, I mean, certain types of films, at least mainstream films specifically, there are characters inside this suspended place, and we identify with them and we project. We project our emotional affect upon them, we project our fears, you know, and this relationship is built. And I think that there, in the composition for Public Park, I think something like this is happening, but it's more not about projecting onto an external sort of figure, but rather projecting onto yourself. So you're sort of like, I mean, I'm making this up, but I'm imagining that, you know, maybe it works like that there's a sense of projection that is happening, self-projection that is happening, and that is maybe why people say it's cinematic, because I've heard that a lot, actually, this term.
The music itself.
Yes. But I think that it's not just, maybe it's dramatic also, like with the strings and stuff, there's something very dramatic.
Quality of Arabic music.
But you're talking specifically about the Arabic part, because people actually refer more to the strings when they were telling me about this. But I don't know. For me, I think it's more, it wasn't intentional that it should be cinematic. I feel it's more structural, that it's this brackets within the brackets. But that's just my interpretation. So, yeah, maybe it's also maybe it's cinematic.
Maybe it's also a bit here in the garden, the part of the garden where the piece is has this sort of circularity,
Yes.
and it is a sort of cinematic space, so
Yes.
it adds to that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, Arabic music is very emotional and very atmospherical.
I mean, I think music in general is emotional and atmospheric by nature because of its form. I find it, how can music not be emotional? Whatever it is, somehow, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have maybe time for one last question, and then.
But then we have to have a question from this side. I insist. Someone
But
has
we
to
cannot
volunteer.
go on further with the streaming, so.
No, I was listening to you and how you're talking about, you know, your work and your product. And I have to say, I was sometimes confused because for me, the product at the end of the day is what the people experience.
Sure.
This is really what you're shaping. I understand you can't claim it, you can't sell it, but that was where I was curious, you know, to what extent when you're doing, you know, your work or your art piece, that you're really also thinking about the experiences which you create and maybe also the vast range of experiences you're creating with this piece.
Yes, we spoke about this yesterday. Well, when I'm working, just to give you a very quick sort of diagram. When I'm working, if I'm editing or shooting something or whatever and listening, doing something and listening, there is always a fantasy audience in my head. This fantasy audience is like a figure that doesn't have any form or shapes or anything, but it's responding to what I'm doing. It's like, oh, no, it's bored, it's interested, it's like, oh, surprised, whatever. It's sort of like reactions. Now, when I think about where are these reactions coming from, I think that these reactions are the accumulation of everything, every person I've met in my life. Every experience, every human interaction I've met in my life is accumulated somewhere inside and, projects itself as a figure that is like looking at what I'm doing and responding to it. So in a sense that it is as if it's an image of, the other outside, the external, every other human being that is internal, that is internalized, and fantasy. It's a fantasy, and I'm using that as my testing ground. And then when it makes sense, when that figure is responding the way that I desire that, then I'm like, that works. So that's kind of like just a diagram of how I'm thinking about it. But you have a question so that we get it before.
Please.
Yeah.
So I have a question, a practical question about your artist practice.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Louder? Okay. I have a question about your artist practice, and the question is quite practical. I was very interested in the fact that you said earlier that you were not trained as an artist, but you are an artist. You are creating art, and you were never trained to be a musician, but you are producing music, you're making music, and so somehow you are experimenting different languages, but also experimenting requires a method, or it brings you to a method eventually, no? So my question is, what is your method despite these changes in the languages you use?
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting question, difficult question. I think in the very beginning, it was like 20-something years ago, it was just like trying to get trying to make something that sounded like what, made sense to me. So when I started also like playing music in the beginning, I was trying to make sounds that sounded like the things I liked. Of course, that's kind of how people start. And that quickly devolved into, mayhem and destroying guitars and feedback and getting a hammer and smashing it and stuff like that. And so when that happened, I don't know, there was also like a rejection of set forms and sort of a desire to just like, whatever, what is this? Also when I was a kid, like whenever I got toys, I broke the toys. I think it's related. So out of that, by doing this and doing this and doing, yes, you learn something and you start producing things more and more and you go beyond the initial just gesture of destruction. So that's where I am at. I'm just in this accumulation and resistance. I guess like I'm learning, but I'm also trying not to learn, you know? It's like a complicated relationship with oneself.
Okay, so our time is
like
up,
unfortunately.
At the end,
it's complicated. Okay.
I want to thank you for being here with us today, for sharing so many things generously with us, and I also want to thank all our guests for participating so actively and for all the wonderful questions.
So much.
Well, enjoy the rest of the day and the exhibition, and goodbye, everybody.
Okay.
And
now I can eat.
And now you can eat, finally.
Okay, thank you. Merci.